Hello and welcome to episode 86 of Now and Zen. Today we're talking to Phillip Golub and Joseph Branciforte about their new microtonal album in 22-tone equal temperament. Phillip is the composer and Joseph is the recording engineer / piano technician assistant. The album is called Loop 7 and features shifting microtonal textures, acoustic piano, vibraphone, and guitar. Without further ado, let's dive into the details of this work and how it was created.
So basically the idea, right, is that there is a 22-tone equal temperament ensemble, and the composition is loop-based. I guess maybe the first question might be for Phillip. I'd love to ask, what got you into 22-tone equal temperament specifically?
Yeah, so I mean, the context for this piece is an ongoing project of mine, which are these sort of loop-based compositions for piano plus other elements. They can be as small scale as solo piano to larger ensembles, which we're exploring now in the recordings that we're making. And Joe here / Greyfade, Joe's label, has been the home of this project, which has been really amazing. And yeah, we're just kind of like in the process of recording some more of those pieces now. So that's the context for this music. We put out a record of 4 of those loops under the title Filters, which was just a solo piano thing, and that was acoustic, solo piano, equal temperament. I then, microtonality's in the air these days. Yeah. And I've been sort of sketching things, learning about things, looking at scores, checking out podcasts like your own, things like that, for the past several years. And yeah, have just started to incorporate more and more microtonality into the various projects I'm doing. So I've been writing more loops in this sort of overall project that I have going, and a couple of them I've said, well, what if we change the tuning systems? And so I've actually got 3 microtonal loops now, in all 3 in different systems, and this is the first one that we've recorded and the first one that we're releasing. And Y22, the others, by the way, they're not in Ito temperaments, but Y22, I guess, it's a common one. It's a favorite of many people because it has so many pure just interval approximations in it. That's why I picked it. I've written a couple of other things in it, but when I was writing the piece, I wasn't like thinking of the just intervals. I was just writing intuitively using my ears, picking intervals. But if you go back and look at the harmonies that are there in the piece, you will find a lot of those 5-4 ratios, 7-4 ratios, whatever, those kind of simple things, ratios that 22 Ito is so good for. And also I guess the other big thing is you'll hear immediately when you hear this piece that it basically transposes by an Ito step this loop cyclically. So it takes advantage of that. That's why we love Ito systems, because they allow transposition.
From the clip I heard, I really liked how many of the pitch structures you had that seemed like they were like it doesn't seem like I could pin down any particular pitch structure as a motive, but the texture was really consistent, like you were exploring a lot of different pitch structures. Is there any kind of basic chord progression or pattern that is in there that you think people might be able to pick up on, or do the loop-based structures sort of abstract it out a little more and make it a little bit less internalizable? Not really a word.
In terms of pitch, like, there isn't a very specific system. However, I'll say two main things. One is that in all the loops I'm writing, sort of in this body of work of mine, I have an approach which is it's not a very limiting thing in terms of what pitches you're allowed to use, but it's just an approach to sort of the way the music flows. And what that is you have a low note and a high note on the sort of lowest and highest end of each moment. And that's kind of like your main melody. And then you have chords that fit in between. And there's basically an alternating between the low notes, between the low and high sonorities, and then the triads or other chord structures in between. Yeah, and it often goes kind of outer, inner, outer, inner, inner, outer, inner, like that. It's like a little bit more inner than outer, but that's just kind of how all the loops are constructed, and that's just the approach I've found. what this so that's the one thing, and this 22 Ito loop composition is no different in that you'll hear that. The thing I did do though is I basically picked a chord in this Ito system and wrote a little loop that ends on basically it loops, but the final chord is one Ito step lower than the original chord you started on,
Yeah.
so that you can just keep going and cycle down. And that was the way I wrote this one. And then what happens is when the second lowest note turns into the original lowest note, because you're cycling down the Ito steps, you remove the lowest note and add it to the top of the original highest note you had. So you get this kind of like MC Escher like thing where bottom notes drop off and reappear at the top. And then I do the same thing, the same process with that chord falling down, wrote another loop that ends on an Ito step lower. And I do that all the way until I've used all the notes and I end up back on the original chord.
Oh, I see. So you have loop 7 is a 28-minute composition, correct? Um,
Yes.
so that means that you're cycling through those 1 20 seconds of an octave. Sort of, are you doing it roughly equidistantly the whole way through that because of how it's structured, or is there
Yeah.
sort of a little bit of variation in timing, or how does that work?
Yeah, so there's actually these sort of like loops I described that go down Ito steps. They go for a while until that second lowest note becomes the lowest note. Then I have a new loop. That loop goes down. Then I have a new loop. That loop goes down until I get the original chord like I just described. So that whole process is one, let's call it macro loop.
Oh, I see.
That big macro loop happens 6 times
Yeah.
in the 28 minutes. So you will recognize like there's like a repetitive thing on a small scale, like, okay, we're hearing this phrase over and over again. And then it goes away and turns into another phrase. And then about 4 or 5 minutes later, that phrase will come back because the whole composition is actually also looping.
What do you think has drawn you to loop-based composition, and how do you make it your own?
It's funny because like I don't write with sort of like process-based or loop-based approaches to things in most of the other music I do. You will find elements of it for sure, but it's not like the focus in most of what I write. I feel like I sort of found this approach to creating music by accident. Um, I actually began writing the first loops as a kind of harmonic exercise for myself. I was just trying to find material for other compositions. And I realized as I was playing them that the experience of playing them is a piece also, and just started to write more and more of these things. And for me, it's for me, a big part of it is that there is the variety that comes from human performance is a huge part of this. So it's not like a technologically produced loop that is consistent, that is exactly the same each time. There are subtle differences in dynamics, in micro timing, in the voicing of the chord, and things like that, which I think they're hard to. Sometimes you can hear them in certain moments in these performances. I think more often than not, you couldn't really, without actually analyzing it or something, you couldn't actually say, oh, that one was clearly different. But you feel that nonetheless, it's happening in front of you and it has a different, I think the experience for the listener is like you're there in real time. It's engaging in some way that is unique because of that. So that's a big part of it for me. And that's why, when I perform these live, I'll go for 45 minutes, sometimes playing one loop, and people will sit there listening because it's always, each moment has the potential to be slightly different than what you've just heard. Yeah, and I find that, that can be an engaging thing, and it can also be something you don't have to pay a lot of attention to. If you want to just sort of like sit back and let it wash over you and not listen in for those differences, that's also a totally valid way to listen to this music. And I think people would do that just as much, and that's interesting too.
Yeah, absolutely. So it can almost be kind of meditative in a way, I suppose. So I think the human element of the performance, since it's so important, that probably ties into using the disclavier pianos. Would one or both of you like to speak to that setup? Because I think I kind of understand it, but I'd love to go over the whole process. It kind of sounds like there was something written in Scordatura, and then it was played as a MIDI performance, and then that was put on disclavier pianos. Is that right?
You want to talk about that process, Joe?
Yeah, that's maybe the only thing I can confidently talk about because it was sort of a little bit of my role in the proceedings here. But yeah, as Philip mentioned, we had done this previous record together on Greyfade, which is a record label that I've been running now for 5 years. It's kind of focused on a lot of these process-based pieces, and also I'm really interested in alternative tunings. And so Philip came to me actually with this loop 7. I want to say it was about a year ago, and said and played me a MIDI version of it that he had done in Piano Tech, which sort of allows you digitally to do these tunings pretty easily and experiment. And I think probably was a huge part of the composition process for Philip, because he was actually able, it wasn't an abstraction, and as a pianist he could actually have a real-time feedback loop and like develop the piece using his ear with that tuning system. So he brought the piece to me and said, hey, would you want to do this as my next release? I've been doing these microtonal pieces. And my reaction was, I loved the piece, I loved the music, but I wondered whether, given that we had already done the first one on an acoustic instrument, like a real grand piano, whether it would be interesting and maybe somehow more unique to actually try to do these microtonal loops on a real instrument. So that kind of excited me, and I think I immediately started thinking of how we could produce the record in such a way that it was sort of a record rather than just a sort of a playback of a MIDI performance, which I mean has its own merits. But I'm personally really interested in going back to this thing of the human performance, like the interaction between the human player and the actual acoustic vibrations of an instrument, and the way that feedback loop kind of affects the whole experience. So anyway, that's all just to say, we were thinking, well, how can we actually do this on a real piano? And immediately, because it's a 22 Edo, it would be pretty much out of the question for any really great instrument to be tuned in that way without really messing up the instrument, because now we're trying to cram 22 pitches into an octave. Yeah, so I started thinking aloud, well, how could we do this? Could there be a way that we could retune the piano and kind of, you play half the notes and then you play the other, and it was sort of like, it was all kind of a compromise, because it's like, well, yeah, but you're not going to get that same kind of pianistic performance if you do it that way. So then the idea occurred to me. I developed a relationship with Yamaha. They have an artist showroom in New York City that I'd worked as a recording engineer before in a few other projects, and I knew that they had disclaviers there. So what I kind of proposed as a crazy idea, I didn't even know if they would say yes. I assumed they probably wouldn't, but I was like, well, we could even just like suggest this idea. And what if we just divided the 22 notes into two different 11 note groupings? And then with the mechanical playback of the two pianos, we could actually kind of reproduce the exact timing and touch of your performance, but it would be actually on the acoustic instrument. So that was kind of the crazy idea. Emailed Yamaha, and they were admittedly a little reluctant, I think, in the beginning to retune the piano. So we kind of went in there and had some meetings and explained the concept, and little by little, I think they warmed up to it. And luckily, we ultimately worked with an amazing technician and tuner there on site who was able to do the piece in 2 passes. So he came in, tuned the piano into what we called, tuning A, which is 11 of the 22 pitches. We recorded that, and it was kind of uncanny because you're sort of just hearing like half the piece, but it's just like random pitch classes that are sort of coming out.
Oh my.
Yeah, so with like all the velocity information, but little dyads and weird, and each time the Edo step would transpose, like Philip was saying, you would hear like different combinations. It was just like really bizarre sounding. But so we did that, and then did another pass with, and then retuned the piano, and then did pass B, and basically made sure that the timing of both of those was precisely accurate, so that when we put them together, you would get the composite. So that's sort of how we approach the the tuning problem. I think other tunings in these other loops that Philip's talking about, the ones that we're recording now, we didn't have this problem. We were able to sort of do it on one instrument because the tunings are a little more versatile in that way for piano. But because this music wasn't really written to be really played on a piano, it was sort of this imaginary instrument that Philip created on Piano Tech. There was a lot of work really with the technical aspects of getting it to actually, to be able to get to the point where we could record it. So that was pretty fun.
What's so cool about, and I totally credit Joe with coming up with this insane idea, which I have to admit I thought would not work when I first read it in my email. But yeah, it's like we get the perception in the recording of an instrument, like of a Yamaha concert grand piano that actually was constructed to have 22 notes in the octave. It's not like two different pianos that are like half of them. It's the same instrument in the same room on the same day with the same microphones in the same position. So it's like when you combine the two layers of audio, you really do get the perception that this is just some instrument that somebody created, which is so cool.
This is such a huge hurdle for performers to have to overcome. I think piano might be the trickiest one because you've got your fretless instruments that you can just slide around on and your guitars that you can take frets off of. But then for piano, it's like, even if you rearrange the MIDI on a keyboard, you have so many notes per octave. And so, people try and do things like Lumitone around it and all of that kind of thing. The biggest thing I wonder about this instrument is that, well, you've got a MIDI performance, right? And so the MIDI performance went on the Disclavier pianos that were retuned. So was the idea that putting them on the Disclavier pianos would sound a lot more real in the room with the instruments than using the same MIDI recording you had, which still has like a human touch to it, but you wanted it to sound like instruments in a room together in that space?
Yeah, I mean, as a producer, sometimes and engineer, it's like I think you can, even if it's very subtle, because I know some of the MIDI instruments now are actually quite good and quite realistic. And Piano Tech has all these parameters where you can really get under the hood and experiment with all this stuff. Still, I think I believe in it enough to have gone through this effort that I think there is something about an instrument in a room with microphones that's somehow different. And I think it's I hope that comes across on the recording and was worth the effort. But I mean, I don't know that this kind of approach is appropriate for every project. And again, like we were talking about, like even to compose the piece, you're not going to have access to that, two perfectly tuned pianos and all this technology to compose it. So I think those tools are amazing for composition and for maybe even like more unnaturalistic sound design. But I guess with the production for this, I was kind of personally interested in like a really naturalistic, almost like chamber music, hyper realism thing, where it was just as if that's what the instrument was in the room. So, and then that kind of, I'll let Phil talk about this, but that carried on to the other acoustic elements that we ended up overdubbing to kind of fill out the ensemble. But it all kind of stemmed with from this idea of like having a sort of realism to the acoustic instruments.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's entirely possible to take a software instrument like Piano Tech and make a recording with it. There are recordings I know that have done that. It can be really cool. For me, what's especially cool about a tool like Piano Tech, in addition to the compositional tool element that Joe just talked about, is when you actually make it sound unrealistic. It can do a pretty damn good piano, but it's just still the case, for reasons that are hard to really understand or know, that an actual instrument with sound waves moving through the air and going into a microphone is just different, as good as it is. But like, for example, now I'm working on a project, also a microtonal project. It's like a whole microtonal jazz record. And I just play a MIDI controller on the record through Piano Tech. And I have created a sound that does not sound like a piano. It sounds somewhere like a Rhodes FM synth piano. It still has like the attack and hammer of a piano and the resonance, but it just sounds not realistic because I messed with all the things. And each song can be in a different tuning, and it's no problem. And I can press a button, and that is like it's not like failing to approximate something that we know. It's just something we don't know, so your ear accepts it
I
as
think
that's
that's
just
part of it
that.
too for me as a
Yeah,
listener, like because the acoustic piano, it's you're so trained to hear it in a certain context that even if it's like if it's even 5% different, you kind of notice it. Whereas like
yeah.
something like the Rhodes, like my friend Will Mason, do you know Will Phillip at all?
Mm-mm.
Anyway, he's this drummer. He just put out a record that's um, also using piano tech, but it's like microtonal Rhodes, and you just put it through an amp, and it's like sounds great. Like I would never even question it at all because it's like the Rhodes is sort of already has this level of mediation where you're used
Yeah,
to hearing it through effects, or you're used to hearing it through an amp. It's like I kind of accept that. Something about piano though, if you're like trying to do that thing, it's like I've heard a lot of, I have other people on the label, like my friend Ken Kirshner, who does a lot of things on digital instruments. And like, I don't know. I don't personally buy that it's the same. There's something about the thing in the room that just is very special still on that instrument. But
yeah. Especially piano. It's just, you know, how many recordings of solo piano have we all heard in our lives from 100 years of over 100 years of different recording techniques, and technologies. We know what pianos sound like. We really know. We've
We know
heard
so
so many.
well.
Yeah,
It's
and it's like if we'd never heard it, and you drop, and then like from the sky, piano tech fell down to the earth, and be like, oh, this is a great new instrument. This sounds great.
yeah,
But
yeah.
like, it's just not
Totally.
like that.
it's almost unnatural how much piano we've all heard in our lives and how attuned we are to piano. Like if it's a little bit off, I think people are more sensitive to pitch difference in piano and also sensitive to microtonality. Like you can play
Yeah.
like the most offensive like 13 tet chords on like feathery organ synths or string sounds and you might be able to get away with it, but if you do that on piano, you'll have to work really hard to disguise the wool fifths or things like that. So
That's
I mean,
actually a
piano.
really profound point that I didn't even think about, but I think that's actually you're really onto something there. There's something about the piano I guess that almost is for me what makes this piece sound so radical in a way is because it's just yeah, it's because it is an acoustic piano and you can really hear it's like it's not part of the way there. It's like really in tune within this tuning system, and you can really hear these transpositions and different things that you're doing like
Yeah.
on the piano.
were
Yeah, I was just going
there
to say, if you look historically speaking, the piano is the whole reason in the first place that we have equal temperament. I mean, it wouldn't have been such an issue if it weren't for the damn piano,
at
So,
piano?
it's like we don't act, equal temperament is a myth. It doesn't actually really exist most of the time. Most instruments have, if you look at what they're actually playing, the intonation is all over the place, and we accept it as more in tune than if it were equal temperament, and our ears want that all the time.
Ah, they
Um,
crave it.
but piano, which also is not technically equal temperament for reasons about how you tune a piano, but nonetheless, it's pretty damn close, and it's definitely the closest we get all the time. So our ears are used to hearing equal temperament from a piano, much more than we're used to hearing equal temperament from a violin or even an instrument with frets. Like guitarists bend notes all the time, like so
Yeah, it's fun to
yeah.
think about an alternate historical timeline where someone fought a war a little differently, and then instead of piano lab, we ended up with like oud lab, and people were less hostile towards microtones in general. I don't know.
We're getting there. We're getting
We're getting there.
there.
I was wondering about the piano recording process. Is there anything that you did to record the piano in a special way to make it sound like one piano as opposed to two pianos in the same room?
I think what Philip said, is the main thing. We kept it is physically the same instrument for both passes, and the microphones were kept in exactly the same position with exactly the same gain structure. Even the panning, we had thought at one point it might be interesting. Well, wow, since we have these two layers, what if we did something crazy and panned one to the left or the right, or eventually start moving, I think we ultimately decided that we kind of want to preserve the illusion of one
Yeah.
instrument. Maybe some of, I don't remember now. Did we might have done like some small amount of that, or did we ultimately decide to just not do
Dude,
it panning?
I don't know if you're okay with divulging secrets, but I mean, what we ended up doing is we did keep the illusion of it being one piano together. What we did do is actually towards the end, the balance between the close and the far mics actually changes.
Oh,
But
that's a yeah.
so it feels like we're getting a little further away and all the other elements are coming. It's very subtle, but it does happen. But that's, a thing that Glenn Gould was doing in the 70s. That's nothing new. You know. So
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess that's worth mentioning that each pass of the piano had three sets of microphones, like a close pair, a mid pair, and a far pair. And close pair is very studio up front. You can hear everything perfectly. The mid pair is a more balanced, kind of like almost classical kind of sound. And then the far pair is like the room, more ambient, that's kind of just blended in to give depth. So whatever the combination was on layer A was the same combination on layer B. So you shouldn't really hear any acoustic differences other than the tuning.
We talk a lot about the piano in the recording and how special it was for that kind of situation, but I also wonder if there was anything done with the other instruments that was particularly novel or groundbreaking in terms of the microtonality.
yeah, so the way we were able to have the guitar and the vibraphone be microtonal, if you look at 22 Ito and you compare it with where those 22 notes fall in relation to equal temperament, you'll find that half of the notes uh, are less than 50 cents higher than an equal temperament note, and half the notes are less than 50 cents lower than an equal temperament note. And so because of the way the vibraphone and the guitar work, of course, the guitar, you can tune strings up or down. The vibraphone, we used, it's called Moortite. It's a kind of like a putty material that you can put on the bar of the vibraphone, which will add weight and lower the pitch. But there's no way to raise the pitch except for creating a custom vibraphone. So what we did is we split up the 22 notes and we gave all the notes that are less than 50 cents lower than a note from equal temperament to the vibraphone, and all the notes that are higher to the guitar, which he used score datura, and we figured out, you can play this note on this string on this fret, and we made him a very specific score that kind of mapped that out for him. And yeah, we just recorded once we had all the notes sort of split up between the two instruments. We did several passes of overdubs, recording different techniques, different sounds, and Joe and I sort of tediously went through and picked our favorite moments and edited together a sort of imaginary performance, imaginary chamber performance.
Yeah. So do you I think I heard you say earlier that there was something like a 45-minute version of this performed. Are there is there a way to perform it, and is there improvisatory scores? Like what's sort of the what would be the directive for the performers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, we've done this live several times and it's something I really want to keep doing. And when we do it live, of course, until somebody offers me the chance to retune two pianos and hook them both up to a one MIDI controller with two disc claviers, which it's got to happen at some point. But until that happens, the way I've been performing this is just through piano tech, which I'll say two things about that. One is that the experience of piano tech through a PA in a room, in a live room, it doesn't quite lose as much as it does on a recording for some reason. Again, a bit of a mystery that I don't quite understand. Um, but now that I'm using piano tech in this performance, because it's the only way I can, what I've done is actually I map some of the sliders on my MIDI controller to different parameters in piano tech so that I can actually change the sound, and it starts sounding like a piano and then it starts to not sound like a piano anymore very slowly. And sort of like when I have a moment in between some notes, I'll just inch the slider like a couple millimeters and kind of slowly change the parameters and do that throughout the performance. And so that's kind of what I'm doing. And then the other musicians are responding to that. And essentially, they have different techniques they can use on their instruments. The vibes can be struck, or they can be bowed, or they can be tremolo. And we're just sort of, there aren't like any specific written rules anywhere, like about, what they can do. But both Ty Sitterman and Aaron Edgecombe, who play the guitar and vibraphone, they're improvisers. They're people from the jazz and creative music world, and I entirely trust them to shape the performance and use their ears, and sort of like the three of us collectively sort of create a different orchestrational journey each time we do it. And we've done it. We can do it for sort of any amount of time until we need to go to the bathroom, theoretically. um,
Amazing limit.
Yeah. The other thing that I guess we should mention too is that for those for the performances, the live performance and the studio recording, I think the idea is really that the performers don't have to play every
That's
note.
right.
They can kind of weave their way through
That's right.
the chart. So that I found that interesting when we were editing too, because it's like even if you literally use the same technique and dynamics, the performers are kind of cherry picking which pitches to play, and so that it adds this sort of orchestrational element to the piano, and it kind of expands the sonic territory of the piano and highlights different pitches. But as the piece goes on, it might be really different as far as the actual orchestration.
So
Yeah, that's a great point. I should have mentioned that's actually probably the most important element is like I'm always playing the whole composition on the piano or keyboard instrument, and the other people who are joining me, they can pick one or two or three or whatever notes. And what that means is every time the loop loops, the listener might be sort of, a certain part is being highlighted for them, a different element of the phrase, a different note in the chord, things like that.
And oftentimes, like in this recording, you'll hear like these moments where the loop is going down by an Edo step, but maybe the performer is choosing a line that's ascending or something. So you get this kind of changing counterpoint, even though it's sort of the same harmony that continues to loop.
it's like sheet music where everyone is synchronized, but then the performers may choose to omit certain notes.
Yes, they have the whole score, and the most basic way to describe their instructions is play some of this. Right. Or pick a line, find your pathway through it. And the other thing I should say is that, it's entirely rubato. So the scores are written in, what some people used to call, or I guess still call, space-time notation. The spacing of one note to the next is roughly equivalent to how it goes. But like I said, the timing is not entirely consistent. So there's certain gestural things I sort of lightly conduct with my body, but the unisons are not necessarily exact unisons, especially in the live performance, and that's just part of it too.
This composition has more splitting up of elements into two halves than I realized because of the vibraphone technique. Do you think that impacted your compositional process at all? Because I find it's definitely a big factor when dealing with these like subsets of attuning performances.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't talked about subsets, and that I think subsets is one of the main ways that you can make all this stuff work on keyboard instruments. And I've done that in some other projects. But no, in this case, I wasn't thinking about that because these loops are fundamentally compositions that can be played by one person at a piano or a keyboard instrument. And then it's like they all have within them the possibility of expanding the orchestration or the use of live electronics processing or the production approach or whatever it may be. But fundamentally, at their core, they're compositions that can be played by two human hands on a keyboard instrument. And I think they will always be that. So, in this case, I don't think I specifically mentioned this in case anyone's wondering, like I did write this on a keyboard where each half step on the MIDI controller is one Edo step. And my score that I'm playing for myself is written in normal note. It's the notes, it's the MIDI notes, and I just play those. And exactly, it's score to chart.
So when you're playing live on one piano, it's using linear mapping where each note is just 1/22nd of an octave. But in the disclavier performance in the room that was using the recording, it was split up so that you could tune it using real acoustic pianos.
Correct. I had to very meticulously take my MIDI performance that
Oh
we were
my.
using to make the record and literally one pitch class, or not pitch class, one like MIDI value at a time, like copy the entire row of notes in the piano roll and move it to the right one, like one by one. And then we had to figure out the mapping of piano A and piano B, and I had to copy all the notes of piano A and mute them in piano B, and copy all the notes of piano B and mute them in piano A. So we had
Oh,
two different MIDI files. It took an afternoon.
yes, I know how long those take. That's one of those microtonal tasks that you just
Yeah.
have to grind through that no one envies. Similarly to like getting a Melodyne performance of someone in a tuning and just having to go through and retune every note by hand to a microtonal note.
One day these things will be automated, and they people will look back at us and think, how did they do that? But yeah.
Yeah, maybe they'll be impressed. I hope so. There's always that weird cocktail of being impressed that people did stuff and also, oh, they were so primitive. They didn't even have the tools that we have.
Yeah.
So, it's like,
Yeah, you never know which one it's gonna be.
yeah, fingers crossed for compassion. It's crazy how much can get lost in translation when you translate from one tuning to another. I'd find that that's something that I've been working with for a really long time, and even in cases where you think it's going to be really cut and dry, it's just not. It's great. Is there anything else you'd like to say about the composition?
We didn't really get into the electronics and the production,
Let's get into that.
and maybe Joe, you want to talk a bit about what we did and how we did it and process and what tools we used and
Yeah,
things
I
like
mean,
that.
it's kind of interesting because we sort of started this conversation with me saying, about the production that we were trying to keep it very, realistic. And then at the end of the day, we kind of started at the end, we did start kind of adding these post-production elements. But I think the idea behind that was that it was like a clear divide. There's like
Yeah.
and there's like acoustic instruments and then there's like other stuff. And they are in the same stew, but it's not like we tried to do the production in a way that's pretty subtle and it kind of walks that line where you don't have to notice the production. So it's pretty subtle. But yeah, we did one thing we did was once we had this structure built out in Pro Tools or whatever of the disc clavier performances, and then we had the vibraphone and the guitar, we were able to kind of shape this trajectory through the 28-minute piece where the orchestration is changing and different elements production wise are kind of occurring. So that eventually, I think by like the third or fourth repetition through the loop, like roughly halfway through the piece, you start getting these low, reinforcements of low synthesizers, electronic processing of different instruments that I did live through some pedals and different tools like that. And then, what I like to do with that is with the electronics is just kind of print a bunch of stuff live and then go back and cull through, kind of like we did with the vibraphone and the guitar, the best moments. So it ends up kind of being, at the end of the day, there is a sort of like produced element to it and a live electronic manipulation aspect. But again, hopefully it's like subtle enough that it doesn't really announce itself as like the most prominent part of the record.
Yeah.
Was the video you posted on Facebook, was it a live performance?
The video, I think, if I'm thinking of the same one, I think that was actually a filmed version of the disc clavier performances.
Yes, that
Uh,
sounds right.
yeah, so basically, yeah, when we were at Yamaha, I set up a camera for each layer A and B, so you can actually see the disc clavier playing back A and B, which is kind of interesting because you can kind of see in the video it's not really playing all the pitches that you're.
Yeah.
So we could cut between A and B, but other than doing a split screen, which I guess we could have done. But yeah, basically you kind of see the process of how it was built up from two instruments.
Yeah. The weirdest thing about that for me was when when you hear the piece, you'll hear one of the sort of like loops within the big loop has some grace notes in it. And
Yeah.
so sometimes like one of the like there's like two grace notes, and sometimes one of them would be in tuning A and one of them would be in tuning B. And
Ah,
so like the weirdest it sounded so weird because there'd sometimes be just like a note and then like a little grace note and then no note after it.
It's like staccato note that just went nowhere. It's like "Dut,
Yeah.
dut, 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 dut."
And
that's so
then when you
odd.
put the other layer together, it's like it just magically makes sense. Like that was just so bizarre to hear.
That's very weird that one's brain could glue that together. I would almost think that that would be a big issue with combining them, that they wouldn't sound seamless, but it sounds like you two pulled it off, so.
I mean, I didn't believe 100% that it would work until we were tracking layer B and in our headphones also monitoring layer A, and the first grace note happened, and it was just like I remember we looked at each other like, "Oh my God, it's working." I knew
I had a
theoretically it was
moment.
going to work because I actually did a mock-up of the two tunings with the two MIDI files in Piano Tech, like to make sure it would work, but I just still didn't really believe it until,
Right.
until that happened.
Yeah. I'm gonna try those things out in the real world. How
Yeah.
did you how did you decide which pieces of the composition to keep overall when you were editing it?
You mean editing the guitar and the vibraphone?
Oh, I thought you said you edited down a longer performance in the recorded version, or is it just as is?
Oh no, this one, the MIDI performance is the performance because we had to basically stick to the MIDI performance that was going to be recorded onto the disc clavier pianos. So I
Mhm.
did some editing of that, just some timings and velocities, certain phrases that didn't quite come out right,
That kind of thing.
with Piano Tech first. But that performance was set. But we did a lot of editing of the different takes of guitar, vibraphones, and electronics.
Yeah. Well, I think it was just great to talk to you guys about this. I really appreciate you coming on and giving us the spiel.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Pleasure talking.
Looking forward to hearing more.
Where are you based?
I'm in Indiana.
Okay.
And how about you guys?
We're both in New York.
Oh, sweet. Yes. I'd suspected. But yeah.
Well,
Cool.
this was awesome talking. Definitely keep us posted on the the pipeline of episodes or whatever. But I'm definitely gonna go on a binge of your YouTube videos right now.
Oh, great. Awesome. I'm excited for that. All right.
Cool.
Adios,
Thanks so
amigos.
much.
Great
Yeah.
meeting you.
Have a good one. Great talking to you.
Take care. Yeah, you too.
much for listening to Now and Zen. We really appreciate it. If you're able to spread the word or leave some positive reviews around, we would also appreciate that as well. Thanks so much to everyone on the Patreon account. Our Zen Harmonic patrons, as well as our Zen Harmonic gods, June Dai Bates Kobashigawa, Naren Rattan, Mike Battaglia, Adam Fries, Matthew Sheeran, Hector McGuffin, Leland O. Weigel, Amy Coleman, Joe Weigel, and Tina Harmon Carto. Catch you next time on Now and Zen.